The early morning sun peeked through Sarah Johnson's bedroom window as her alarm buzzed at 6 o'clock a.m. She reached over to silence it, careful not to disturb the peaceful quiet of dawn. At 38, Sarah had mastered the art of early morning routines, something that came with being both a single mother and a dedicated pediatric nurse at Atlanta General Hospital. "Amara, sweetie, time to wake up," Sarah called out while quickly making her bed. Her voice carried down the hallway to where her 10-year-old daughter slept. This morning was running slightly behind schedule because Sarah had covered Sandra's night shift at the hospital. She had gotten home at midnight, giving her barely 6 hours of sleep. The house came alive with morning sounds. The coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen, the shower running upstairs, and Amara's footsteps as she shuffled to the bathroom. Sarah smiled at the familiar routine they had developed over the years. Since Amara's father had left them when she was just 2, they had become an inseparable team. Sarah stood in front of her closet, choosing her navy blue scrubs for the day. Her hospital ID badge hung ready on its special hook. Sarah Johnson, RN, Pediatric Unit, it read, along with a photo of her warm smile. She had earned her position through years of hard work, starting as a nursing assistant and studying late into the nights to complete her degree while raising Amara. "Mom, have you seen my science project folder?" Amara's voice carried from her room, slightly panicked. Sarah remembered placing it on the kitchen counter the night before, making sure it wouldn't be forgotten. Today was the science fair presentation, one of the reasons they couldn't be late. "It's downstairs, honey. Don't forget to pack your lunch, too." Sarah responded while quickly applying her minimal makeup, just enough to look professional but practical for a 12-hour shift. The kitchen became their morning command center. Sarah packed Amara's favorite lunch, a turkey sandwich with no crust, apple slices, and the special cookies they had baked together on Sunday. Meanwhile, Amara sat at the counter, spooming cereal into her mouth while reviewing her science project notes one last time. "Mom, do you think I'll win first place?" Amara asked between bites, her eyes showing a mix of hope and nervousness. Sarah paused from preparing her own lunch to give her daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You've worked so hard on this project, showing how plants grow differently under various light conditions. That's real science, baby. Whatever happens today, I'm already so proud of you," Sarah assured her, meaning every word. Amara had inherited her mother's curiosity and determination, traits that made Sarah's heart swell with pride. Time ticked by faster than they realized. Sarah glanced at the kitchen clock. 7:15 a.m. "Oh shoot, we need to get moving," she exclaimed. They had to leave by 7:20 to make it to school by 7:45, and Sarah needed to be at the hospital by 8:30. They rushed through their final morning tasks, Amara grabbing her backpack and science project, Sarah collecting her nursing bag and both their lunches. The morning sun was bright now as they stepped out onto their small front porch, the Georgia humidity already starting to build. Their old Toyota Camry sat in the driveway, reliable despite its age. Sarah had been saving for a new car, but Amara's education fund always took priority. They loaded their bags into the back seat, and Sarah helped Amara secure her science project in its special box. "Seatbelt on?" Sarah asked, following their usual safety routine. Amara nodded, already absorbed in reviewing her presentation notes one final time. Sarah smiled at her daughter's reflection in the rearview mirror, thankful for these simple morning moments they shared. As they pulled out of their driveway and into the morning traffic, Sarah mentally reviewed their schedule. Drop Amara at school, then take the Johnson Creek shortcut to the hospital. The route was so familiar she could drive it with her eyes closed, though she never would. Safety first, that was one of her life's main rules. Neither Sarah nor Amara could have known that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. As they merged onto Main Street, joining the steady stream of commuters and school traffic, they were simply mother and daughter, starting what they thought would be just another normal day. The morning traffic moved steadily as Sarah guided her Toyota through the familiar streets of Atlanta. Amara sat quietly in the back seat, still practicing her science fair speech under her breath. The clock on the dashboard showed 7:32 a.m. They were cutting it close, but not impossibly late. Sarah approached the four-way stop at Oak and Maple Street, the same intersection she'd crossed hundreds of times before. She came to a complete stop, checking all directions carefully before proceeding. In her rearview mirror, She noticed a police cruiser that hadn't been there moments before. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, remembering everything she'd taught Amara about police interactions. She signaled and pulled over to the right side of the road, making sure to stop in a well-lit area where other morning commuters could see them. "Mom," Amara's voice carried a note of worry. "Did we do something wrong?" "Everything's fine, sweetie," Sarah assured her daughter, though she knew she hadn't broken any traffic laws. "Remember what we practiced? Just stay calm and quiet, okay?" She turned off the car, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and took steady breaths. Through her side mirror, Sarah watched Officer James Miller approach. He was a tall man with a rigid posture, his hand resting unnecessarily on his weapon as he walked toward their car. Something about his demeanor made Sarah's nurse's instincts, finely tuned to reading people, flash a warning. "License and registration," Officer Miller demanded before they had even fully reached her window. His tone was harsh, lacking the professional courtesy Sarah had experienced in other traffic stops. "Good morning, officer," Sarah responded politely, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "My license is in my purse, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" Officer Miller didn't respond, just stared at her with cold eyes. Sarah could feel Amara's anxiety building in the back seat as she carefully retrieved her documents. The morning sun caught her hospital ID badge as she moved, making her name and position clearly visible. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Officer Miller asked, his voice carrying an edge that seemed inappropriate for a routine traffic stop. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah replied truthfully. "I'm certain I made a complete stop at the intersection." Officer Miller's face hardened. "You ran that stop sign back there. I saw it clear as day." He glanced at her documents, then at Sarah's face, then back at the papers in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Officer, I respectfully disagree," Sarah stated calmly. "I always come to a complete stop at that intersection. It's on my daily route to take my daughter to school." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked past Sarah to Amara in the back seat, then at the science project box beside her. "You people always think you know better, don't you?" he muttered, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. Sarah's chest tightened at his words, recognizing the implied meaning. She glanced in her rearview mirror, seeing Amara's worried face. Her daughter was old enough to understand what was happening, and that knowledge broke Sarah's heart. "I'd like to see your proof of insurance as well," Officer Miller demanded, his tone growing more aggressive. "And step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why you need me to step out for a routine traffic stop?" Sarah inquired politely but firmly, aware that her daughter was watching every moment of this interaction. Other cars passed by slowly, some drivers clearly noticing the situation. Sarah saw Mrs. Thompson, another parent from Amara's school, drive past with a concerned look. The morning sun was higher now, making everything starkly visible. Officer Miller placed his hand back on his weapon, a gesture that seemed deliberately threatening. "I'm not asking again. Step out of the vehicle." Sarah met Amara's eyes in the rearview mirror, trying to convey reassurance even as she felt her own anxiety rising. She noticed Officer Miller's body camera had a dark lens, either turned off or covered. The morning that had started so normally was quickly turning into something much more serious. "Please remember, officer," Sarah said carefully, "my 10-year-old daughter is in the car, and we're on our way to her school's science fair." She reached for her door handle, moving slowly and deliberately, knowing the next few moments would be crucial. The morning air felt heavy as Sarah stepped out of her car, following Officer Miller's demands. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, very aware of her daughter's frightened eyes watching from the back seat. The sound of passing traffic seemed distant now, as if the world was holding its breath. "Stand by the rear of your vehicle," Officer Miller ordered, his voice carrying a tone that made several passing drivers slow down to observe. Sarah complied, taking careful steps backward, her hospital ID badge swaying gently against her navy blue scrubs. "Officer Miller," Sarah spoke calmly, reading his nameplate, "I want to understand why this situation is escalating. I'm a pediatric nurse heading to work after dropping my daughter at school. If there's a problem, we can discuss it professionally." Miller's face twisted with obvious disdain. "Oh, so you think being a nurse makes you special? Makes you above the law?" He stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space. I saw you run that stop sign, and now you're giving me attitude. Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart raced. Through the car window, she could see Amara had started recording with her tablet. Something Sarah had taught her to do if she ever felt unsafe. She felt a mix of pride and sadness that her 10-year-old needed to know such things. I did not run the stop sign, Officer Miller, Sarah stated firmly but respectfully. And my profession isn't about being special, it's about helping people, just like law enforcement should be. This seemed to anger Miller further. He stepped even closer, his badge catching the morning sunlight. Are you telling me how to do my job? His hand rested on his weapon again, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the growing number of observers. Mrs. Thompson, who had driven past earlier, had now parked across the street and was openly recording the interaction on her phone. 2 other cars had stopped as well, their drivers watching with concerned expressions. No, sir, Sarah responded, keeping her voice steady. I'm simply trying to understand why a routine traffic stop requires this level of intimidation. My daughter is watching, and she's already late for her science fair. Officer Miller glanced at the car, then back at Sarah. Maybe if you people spend more time teaching your kids respect for authority instead of having to make excuses. Excuse me? Sarah interrupted, her professional calm cracking slightly at the obvious racism in his words. What exactly do you mean by you people, Officer Miller? The officer's face reddened. Don't you dare interrupt me. I can make this morning a lot more difficult for you. He reached for his ticket book with unnecessary force, nearly dropping it. Sarah noticed his body camera was definitely off, the indicator light was dark. She made a mental note of this detail, along with the time showing on her car's dashboard. 7:43 a.m. More vehicles had stopped now. Sarah recognized Mr. Rodriguez from the local coffee shop filming from his parked delivery van. The presence of witnesses provided some comfort, but also increased the tension in the air. I'm going to search your vehicle, Miller announced suddenly, taking a step toward the car where Amara sat. Officer Miller, I do not consent to a search, Sarah stated firmly, stepping slightly to the side to remain in his field of vision. There's no probable cause, and my daughter needs to get to school. If you're writing me a ticket for the alleged stop sign violation, please do so quickly. The officer turned back to her, his face now contorted with anger. You don't give the orders here, he shouted, loud enough that Amara flinched visibly in the car. I'm tired of dealing with people like you who think they know the law. Sarah stood her ground, though every instinct told her to get back in her car and drive away. She thought about her daughter watching, about every other mother's child who had faced similar situations. Her voice remained steady as she spoke. Officer Miller, I know my rights, and I'm exercising them calmly and legally. You haven't shown me any evidence of wrongdoing, your body camera is off, and you're making statements that could be considered discriminatory. I'd like to speak with your supervisor. The morning sun now cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the growing crowd of witnesses. More phones were recording, more eyes watching. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with Officer Miller's face growing darker with each passing second. No one could have predicted what would happen next, but everyone's cameras were rolling when it did. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Miller's face contorted with uncontrolled rage. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, and the growing crowd of onlookers held their phones steady, recording every moment of what was about to unfold. You want my supervisor? Miller's voice rose dangerously. You think you're so smart, don't you? Standing here, talking about rights and discrimination. He moved closer to Sarah, his body language becoming more threatening with each step. Sarah stood her ground, though every instinct told her to retreat. She could hear Amara's scared breathing from the car behind her. The tablet in her daughter's hands trembled slightly as she continued recording, just as Sarah had taught her. Yes, Officer Miller, I would like to speak to your supervisor, Sarah repeated calmly, keeping her hands visible at her sides. There's no need for this situation, Toe. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. Officer Miller's hand had moved so fast that even the people recording barely caught the motion. The impact snapped Sarah's head to the side, her hospital ID badge swinging wildly from the force. Several witnesses gasped audibly, and Mrs. Thompson across the street shouted, "Oh my God! Mom!" Amara's scream from inside the car pierced the morning air. She scrambled to open her door, but Sarah quickly raised her hand, signaling her daughter to stay put. Sarah slowly turned her face back toward Officer Miller, her cheek burning red where his hand had struck her. The taste of copper filled her mouth, her lip was bleeding. She didn't raise her hand to touch it, knowing better than to make any sudden movements. "Officer Miller," Sarah spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent street, "you just assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses, including my minor daughter. Your body camera is off, but at least 12 people are recording this incident right now." Miller seemed to freeze, finally registering the crowd that had gathered. Mr. Rodriguez from his delivery van was live streaming the entire incident. 2 school buses had stopped, the drivers and students all watching through windows. Mrs. Thompson had moved closer, her phone steady as she captured every detail. "You assaulted a civilian," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm unarmed, compliant, and you struck me without provocation. I want your badge number, your supervisor's contact information, and I'm filing a formal complaint." The realization of what he'd done seemed to hit Officer Miller all at once. His face paled slightly as he looked around at the sea of recording phones. A police car's siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone in the crowd had called 911. "You're interfering with a police investigation," Miller tried to recover, his voice less certain now. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "No, Officer Miller, I will not," Sarah stated firmly, blood from her split lips staining her words. "I have not broken any laws. You, however, have just committed assault against an unarmed mother in front of her child. I'm standing right here until your supervisor arrives." Amara's tablet captured everything perfectly, her mother's steady stance, the officer's increasingly uncertain expression, and the growing crowd of witnesses. The young girl's hands had stopped shaking now, replaced by a determined focus she'd learned from watching her mother face challenges head-on. 2 more police cars turned onto the street, lights flashing. Sarah could see Officer Miller's demeanor changing as his colleagues approached. His hand, which had so confidently struck her moments ago, now trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his threat sounded hollow now. "You're right, it's not," Sarah agreed, her voice clear enough for all the cameras to pick up. "This is just the beginning." The morning sun now illuminated the entire scene. Sarah standing tall in her nurse's scrubs, blood trickling from her lip. Officer Miller backing away as his fellow officers approached. Amara in the car, her tablet steady as she recorded. And the crowd of witnesses, their phones documenting every second of what would soon become a viral symbol of both injustice and resistance. As the backup officers rushed toward the scene, Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes locked on Officer Miller. In that moment, she wasn't just standing for herself or her daughter. She was standing for every person who had ever faced such abuse of power in silence. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a well-orchestrated response to injustice. Sarah stood calmly as Sergeant Martinez, the supervising officer who arrived on scene, assessed the situation. Blood still trickled from her split lip, but she refused to wipe it away. Every drop was evidence. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Martinez." The female officer introduced herself, her expression professional but concerned. "We've called medical assistance for you, and I need your statement about what happened here." Sarah nodded, her nurse's training kicking in as she documented every detail. "Before I give my statement, I need to check on my daughter." She turned toward her car where Amara sat, still recording, tears streaming down her face but her hands steady on the tablet. "Baby, I'm okay," Sarah assured her daughter through the open window. "Keep recording, just like we practiced, but I need you to call Principal Williams. Tell her what happened and why you'll be late for the science fair." Sergeant Martinez watched this interaction, noting how Sarah remained composed despite the chaos around them. Officer Miller stood off to the side, now surrounded by 2 other officers who had removed his badge and weapon, standard procedure after a civilian assault. Mrs. Thompson approached Sarah, her phone still recording. "I got everything," she said firmly. "The slap, his threats, everything. I'm already uploading it to multiple platforms, and I'll be your witness." Mr. Rodriguez joined them, his delivery van's dashcam having captured another angle. "My camera got it all too, from when he first pulled you over. The stop sign. You made a complete stop. I deliver on this route every morning. I saw it clear as day." Sarah thanked them both, her nurse's training guiding her actions. She took photos of her injury using her phone's front camera, careful to document the redness and swelling. Then she pulled out a small notepad from her scrub's pocket, a habit from work, and began writing down every detail while it was fresh in her mind. The paramedics arrived, but Sarah insisted on completing her documentation first. Time of incident, 7:47 a.m. Officer's badge number clearly visible, 6781. Body camera visibly turned off before the confrontation began. Sergeant Martinez stood nearby. 1 week after the incident, Sarah sat in the office of civil rights attorney Marcus Washington, surrounded by evidence carefully collected from that morning. The bruise on her lip had faded, but the determination in her eyes burned stronger than ever. "Ms. Johnson," Attorney Washington said, reviewing the files spread across his desk, "you've provided us with exceptional documentation. 12 different video angles, 27 witness statements, and your own detailed notes. This is probably the most well-documented case of police misconduct I've seen in my 15 years of practice." Sarah nodded, adjusting her nurse's ID badge. She'd come straight from her hospital shift. "I want to make sure this case isn't just about me, Mr. Washington. This needs to create real change." The office walls were covered with framed newspaper articles about Attorney Washington's successful civil rights cases. Now, printouts of social media posts about Sarah's incident filled his bulletin board. The hashtag #NurseStandStrong had grown into a national movement, with millions of shares and supporters. The hospital's legal team sent over their statement of support this morning, Marcus said, holding up an official letter. "Dr. Chen wrote a powerful testimony about your character and professional record. Your entire unit signed a petition supporting your legal action." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Thompson. The video she'd uploaded had reached 20 million views. Major news networks were requesting interviews, but Sarah had declined them all, focusing instead on building her legal case. 3 weeks after the incident, the conference room at the Internal Affairs Department buzzed with activity. Large screens displayed multiple video angles of the confrontation between Sarah and Officer Miller, while investigators pored over thick files spread across the long table. Captain Reynolds, head of Internal Affairs, stood before a timeline they created on the wall. Red pins marked previous complaints against Officer Miller, while yellow strings connected patterns of similar incidents. The evidence Sarah had helped collect filled 3 entire boards. The body camera footage from that morning is particularly damning, investigator Lisa Chen reported, clicking through surveillance images. Not only did Officer Miller deliberately turn off his camera before the confrontation, but the dashcam audio caught him making racially charged comments before he even approached Ms. Johnson's vehicle. Sarah sat quietly at the end of the table, still in her nursing scrubs after finishing her morning shift. She watched as more investigators filed into the room, carrying new evidence boxes. The case had grown far beyond her single incident. "We interviewed 38 witnesses from the scene," another investigator shared, spreading out statements. "Every single account matches Ms. Johnson's version of events. Mrs. Thompson's video alone has been verified by 3 different forensic experts." The door opened, and Sergeant Martinez entered with more files. "The review of Officer Miller's past cases is complete," she announced. "We found 27 incidents where his body camera mysteriously malfunctioned during traffic stops, all involving minority drivers." Sarah's phone lit up with a message from her daughter. Amara had started a student group at her school called Know Your Rights, teaching other kids how to safely document police interactions. Her science project about civilian documentation had been featured in the local newspaper. The hospital sent over Ms. Johnson's complete employment record, Captain Reynolds said, holding up another file. 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations for crisis management, and letters of recommendation from every supervisor she's worked under. The contrast between Sarah's professional history and Officer Miller's record couldn't have been clearer. While she had spent years saving lives and building trust, he had accumulated a pattern of aggressive behavior and discrimination. "What about the other officers who responded that day?" Sarah asked, speaking up for the first time. "The ones who saw Officer Miller's behavior over the years but never reported it." Captain Reynolds nodded grimly. "That's our next phase of investigation. 3 officers have already come forward, requesting whistleblower protection. They're ready to testify about a culture of silence and cover-ups." On the wall-mounted TV, news coverage played silently. Sarah's case had sparked investigations in police departments across the country. Other victims were coming forward, armed with their own videos and witnesses, inspired by how she had handled her situation. The FBI Civil Rights Division has requested all our files, Sergeant Martinez announced. They're opening a parallel investigation into departmental patterns and practices. This case has become a catalyst for federal oversight. Sarah checked her watch. Almost time for her meeting with the Police Reform Committee. As a newly appointed civilian advisor, she was helping draft new policies for police accountability and community relations. One more thing, Lisa Chen added, pulling up a final document. We've completed the analysis of traffic stop data from the past 5 years. Officer Miller's racial bias isn't just evident in individual incidents, it's proven by the statistics. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the conference room windows as the investigators continued their work. What had started as one mother's stand against injustice had unveiled a system desperately in need of change. Ms. Johnson, Captain Reynolds said, turning to Sarah, your documentation and professional handling of this incident didn't just build a strong case, it's changing how we conduct internal investigations. You've set a new standard for civilian oversight. Sarah thought about all the others who had faced similar situations without witnesses or videos. This investigation isn't just about punishing one officer, she replied. It's about fixing a broken system. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah noticed new photos being added to the evidence boards. More victims, more incidents, more patterns emerging. But now, finally, people were paying attention. The wall of silence was crumbling, one testimony at a time. The police chief wants to meet with you tomorrow, Sergeant Martinez said as Sarah reached the door. Your case has become a turning point for the department. Change is coming, thanks to your courage that morning. Sarah paused, looking back at the room full of evidence her actions had helped uncover. No, she corrected gently. Change is coming because people are finally ready to see the truth and brave enough to stand up for it. 6 months after that fateful morning traffic stop, Sarah Johnson stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber. The room was packed with community members, press, and police officials. Amara sat in the front row, now 11 years old, holding her tablet, the same one that had recorded the incident that changed their lives. Today marks a new beginning, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. The City Council's unanimous vote to pass the Johnson Police Accountability Act shows that when we stand together, real change is possible. Behind her, on a large screen, the numbers told the story of their victory. Officer Miller had been officially terminated from the police force. Criminal charges for assault and civil rights violations were proceeding through the courts. But more importantly, the department was implementing sweeping reforms. In the past 6 months, Sarah continued, we've seen incredible changes. Every police officer now wears body cameras that cannot be manually disabled. De-escalation training is mandatory. And most importantly, a new civilian oversight board has been established. The crowd included familiar faces from that morning. Mrs. Thompson, who had recorded the crucial video, Mr. Rodriguez, whose delivery Van Dashcam had captured everything, and Sergeant Martinez, who had helped break down the wall of silence within the department. But our work isn't finished, Sarah said, turning to a new page in her notes. Today, I'm proud to announce the launch of the Johnson Justice Initiative. She paused as Amara joined her at the podium, carrying a large presentation board. The initiative, funded by community donations and support from civil rights organizations, would provide resources and training to help other victims of police misconduct document and report abuse. Sarah would serve as its executive director while continuing her work as a nurse. My daughter taught me something important, Sarah shared, putting her arm around Amara. When she kept recording that morning, even through her tears, she showed me that the youngest among us understand the power of truth and documentation. In the audience, Dr. Chen smiled proudly. The hospital had become a partner in the initiative, offering training spaces and professional support. Sarah's nursing colleagues had all volunteered to help teach documentation skills to community members. Today, we're not just celebrating justice in one case, Sarah continued. We're celebrating a new era of accountability. She gestured to the police chief, who stood and joined them at the podium. Chief Williams, newly appointed after the previous chief's resignation, stepped forward. Thanks to Ms. Johnson's case, we've identified and removed 12 other officers with patterns of misconduct. Our department is stronger because we faced our failures and committed to real change. Amara unfolded her presentation board, revealing statistics from the first month of reforms. Civilian complaints were being properly investigated. Use of force incidents had dropped by 60%. Community trust was slowly being rebuilt. The Johnson Police Accountability Act isn't just a local victory, Sarah explained. 10 other cities have already adopted similar measures. Our story has become a blueprint for change across the country. The audience rose in a standing ovation as Sarah introduced the first graduates of the Community Documentation Training Program. 20 citizens, ranging from teenagers to grandparents, who had learned how to safely and effectively document police interactions. Remember, Sarah said, her voice full of emotion, that morning could have ended differently. But because we had witnesses, because we had documentation, because we had a community that refused to look away, we turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Amara stepped forward to the microphone, her voice strong and clear. My mom taught me that standing up for justice isn't just about being brave in the moment. It's about being prepared, being professional, and never giving up until things change. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah looked out at the packed chamber. She saw hope in the faces looking back at her, hope and determination. The morning that had started with fear and injustice had sparked a transformation none of them could have imagined. Later that evening, as Sarah and Amara walked to their car, now parked in the spot reserved for the initiative's executive director, they passed the police station. Through the windows, they could see new training sessions in progress, officers learning from community members about building trust and respect. Mom, Amara said, stopping to look at the station's new community outreach center, do you think things will stay different now? Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. They'll stay different because we'll keep working to make them different. That's what justice means. Not just winning one battle, but changing the whole system, one day at a time. The setting sun cast long shadows across the city, but for Sarah and Amara, the future had never looked brighter.